The first thing people noticed about the ship was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy silence of people who had learned not to speak unless necessary. As it edged closer to Manila Bay, the sea reflecting a tired sunrise, hundreds of eyes stared at the unfamiliar shoreline with the same question pulsing through their minds. Will this country turn us away too? Among them was a young man named Lev Abramovich, his coat too thin for the memories he carried. He stood near the railing, gripping it as if the ship might vanish beneath his feet. Behind him were families who had fled burning cities, smashed windows, and whispered threats. Ahead of him was a place most of them had barely heard of, a tropical country, halfway across the world, spoken of only in rumors passed from mouth to mouth like a fragile secret. The Philippines, a place where they were told doors had not yet closed. Lev had learned long ago not to trust hope. In Europe, hope had been dangerous. Hope had convinced people to stay too long, to believe that neighbors would remain neighbors, that governments would remember their humanity. Hope had been shattered by laws, uniforms, and boots on cobblestone streets. When Lev's family fled, it wasn't because they wanted to leave their home. It was because the world had suddenly decided they no longer belonged to it. As the ship slowed, Lev noticed something strange. There were no soldiers lining the docks with rifles, no shouting, no dogs. Instead, there were men in light-colored uniforms, port workers, and a small group of officials waiting calmly under the rising heat. Someone whispered that the president himself had approved their arrival. Someone else said the Philippines was poor but kind. Lev didn't know which mattered more. When his feet finally touched Filipino soil, he felt something unfamiliar, relief without fear attached to it. This was not the first ship like his, and it would not be the last. Years earlier, another group of refugees had arrived under similar circumstances, carrying different accents, but the same hollow look in their eyes. They were Jewish families escaping a Europe that had turned into a trap. At the center of that decision stood President Manuel Quezon, a man who understood what it meant to fight for dignity in a world ruled by powerful empires. Quezon was not blind to reality. The Philippines was still under American rule, its economy fragile, its people struggling with poverty and disease. Advisors told him it was impractical, even dangerous to accept refugees. They warned of political backlash, cultural differences, and scarce resources. But Quezon had lived long enough to know that fear was the easiest excuse for inaction. He listened instead to a quieter voice, the belief that a nation's worth was not measured by how much it owned, but by how much it was willing to share. Through quiet diplomacy and determined insistence, Quezon opened the doors of the Philippines to Jewish refugees when many nations slammed theirs shut. Over 1,200 found safety in Manila, bringing with them skills, knowledge, and stories of survival. They built schools, businesses, and synagogues. They worked alongside Filipinos, learned local customs, and discovered that kindness did not require a shared language. Children who had once slept in fear now played under palm trees. Parents who had memorized escape routes learned the names of new streets. For the first time in years, families planned futures instead of exits, and then history repeated itself. After the war, as Europe tried to rebuild from ruins, another crisis unfolded far from Manila's shores. In China, thousands of Russians, white Russians who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution years earlier, found themselves stateless once again. Political shifts turned yesterday's refuge into today's danger. Camps filled with people who had nowhere to go and no country willing to take them. The world was exhausted by war. Compassion fatigue set in. Borders tightened, except in the Philippines. President Elpidio Quirino, who had lost his own family to wartime atrocities, understood grief in its most personal form. He knew what it meant to watch loved ones disappear and futures collapse. When reports reached him about thousands of Russian refugees stranded and unwanted, he did not ask what the Philippines would gain. He asked what it would lose if it turned away. Under his leadership, the Philippines accepted more than 5,000 refugees, offering them temporary sanctuary on Tubabao Island in eastern Samar. It was not a luxurious refuge. The island was battered by storms, plagued by shortages, and isolated from the comforts of civilization. But it was safe. And for people who had lived in fear for decades, safety was everything. Lef's story, though fictional, mirrored many real lives shaped by these decisions. On Tubabao, refugees built small communities from nothing. They constructed churches out of scrap wood, organized schools under makeshift roofs, and taught their children that survival was not just about staying alive, but about preserving dignity. Filipino locals watched with curiosity as unfamiliar traditions unfolded beside their own. Despite language barriers, connections formed. Food was shared. Skills were exchanged. Laughter returned to places that had known only waiting. Lef found work repairing radios, a skill he had learned from his father long before the world unraveled. Filipino fishermen brought him broken equipment, and he fixed them in exchange for meals and stories. Slowly, the island transformed from a temporary shelter into a living testament to what happens when empathy outweighs fear. What made these moments extraordinary was not that the Philippines was wealthy or powerful. It wasn't. What made them extraordinary was that the country chose humanity at a time when humanity felt inconvenient. These stories are rarely told in textbooks. They don't fit neatly into timelines of battles and treaties. But they matter. They remind us that history is not only shaped by those who conquer, but also by those who welcome. In classrooms today, students may learn about wars and leaders, but few are taught that a small Southeast Asian nation once stood as a beacon of refuge while the rest of the world looked away. Few are told that Filipinos who had endured colonization, occupation, and poverty still found room in their hearts for strangers. Lef eventually left the Philippines, as many refugees did, resettling in countries that offered permanent homes. But he carried the islands with him. Not just the heat or the food, but the memory of being seen as human when humanity was in short supply. Decades later, long after ships stopped arriving and camps were dismantled, the impact of those decisions remained. Descendants of Jewish refugees and Russian families still speak of the Philippines with gratitude, calling it a place that gave them back their lives. Historians point to these moments as rare examples of moral courage in an era defined by fear. The lesson is simple, but powerful. A nation does not need to be rich to be generous. It does not need to be perfect to be brave. Sometimes all it takes is the willingness to say yes when the world says no. When the ship finally emptied and Manila Bay returned to its daily rhythm, few noticed the significance of what had happened. There were no grand celebrations, no monuments erected in that moment. Just tired people stepping onto land, breathing freely for the first time in years. And perhaps that is the greatest heroism of all the kind that doesn't seek applause. Only the quiet knowledge that, when history asked a difficult question, the Philippines answered with compassion. Long after the refugees moved on, the sea kept its secrets. But if you listen closely, you might still hear them footsteps on wooden docks, whispered prayers of relief, and the echo of a country that chose to open its arms when the world closed its doors.